about what is likely one of the most hotly debated and polarizing cases, if we can even call it an individual case, in the UFO community in the year 2024. It may go without saying, but we'll say it anyway. Bob Lazar is the now notorious Area 51 whistleblower who, under an assumed name, as we've said in 1989, gave an interview wherein he made numerous allegations under the name Dennis, which we are still discussing to this day. So we'll start it off from you guys. What do we know about the history, the events surrounding Bob Lazar? Let's start with his initial entrance into the public light, because there are a lot of events surrounding Bob Lazar.
Well, Bob Lazar is one of those, what we might call a mystery wrapped within an enigma, right? Because when he first comes on the scene, he isn't necessarily coming out using his real name. It was later revealed that Dennis had kind of been a jab at someone, one of his superiors allegedly there at this facility that he worked for. But the story was essentially, as revealed to investigative reporter George Knapp, that he had worked at a location called S4 where they were testing flying saucers. I mean, that in a nutshell is what he says happened. He says that he had previously worked with Los Alamos, and that as a physicist that he had been brought in to try and understand the propulsion systems on these craft, how they worked. He was provided only certain amounts of information. He said it was extremely compartmentalized. What he knew, other people did not necessarily know, and what they know and what some of his predecessors had worked on, he had not necessarily been made privy to. But during his time there, he said that he had not only studied the mechanism that presumably allowed the propulsion of these craft, but that he'd been inside one. He described the interior as being very Spartan, no color really apart from just kind of a metal exterior, and an interior that was very similar. Obviously, these beings that would have been inside this craft were very small. He didn't know where these came from or how the United States government reportedly obtained these, although I think it had been implied in one case that maybe one had been acquired during some kind of an archaeological investigation, is kind of what he alluded to. And since Lazar came forward and told these stories, I mean, his stories remained pretty controversial because we're still trying to figure out, how much of or if this story is true, and if it is, what does that mean? Obviously, the big implication would seem to be, that the United States government knows a whole lot more about this phenomenon, the UAP phenomenon, than it lets on, but also that we're still trying to figure out some of the technologies that have allegedly been acquired. There are those who believe all that, and then there are those who say, yeah, we don't believe Bob Lazar, and there are real problems with his story. I guess we should dive into it.
Can someone talk about the jet car, the jet engine being strapped to the car? Just a quick breakdown of that.
I think the whole jet car thing is an important part of Lazar's personality for people to understand, which is the idea that he loved speed and he had the wherewithal to actually make that work. Mm-hmm. He says in one of his writings that he grew up as one of those kids who loves to take things apart and put them back together again. And this really fits into that mold, where he was able to do it, wanted to do it, and just had that sort of all-American, let's see how fast we can go type of personality, and put that to work in this practical way, which he implies in his memoir that helped him to get in the door at Los Alamos because of his ability to, the physics behind all of that, actually making it work, and then taking people for test rides in it. Didn't necessarily help his resume, but it didn't hurt it either.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
It did display that he had at least some kind of an ability to marry up technologies that should have been incompatible, because I should not be in operation of a jet-operated car. I don't know about any of you, but these things don't really belong together. So it does kind of fit with the whole narrative, because it's alleged that after this experience, he was offered the job and he was hired to reverse engineer alien propulsion systems, which, let's talk about that for a moment. The whole idea of reverse engineering something that is as advanced as these craft are purported to be, what does that look like? Can we even start wrapping our heads around that?
I know that, the alleged S4 location, there were 9 craft, and I know supposedly they were trying to back engineer the Roswell craft, but there was one in particular that's housed, there was extraterrestrial craft that they can't figure out at all, and it's this pyramidal black, almost amorphous liquid craft that is truly extraterrestrial. But I think the different craft, maybe they're able to make progress or get into by a laser technology or what. I just think it would be very difficult, and it makes sense it would take decades to maybe even get into some of these craft if we have them.
I mean, put this out there just as a thought experiment. I mean, if you handed, for instance, an iPhone to a child, a human child, they can usually figure that out pretty quickly. I mean, I see kids these days doing incredible things. What's really scary is they'll take a book, an old book, and they'll try to expand it and make it, larger like you do with an iPhone.
I can vouch for this. I have a 1-year-old
Yeah,
that
yeah,
does
I'm
that.
sure you
Yes.
can. But if you hand that iPhone to a cat or a dog, they're probably not going to recognize it as being a technology. And at least in some of the descriptions we hear of alleged acquisitions, I mean, for what's worth, I have heard from people, like many who do research in this field, stories about alleged acquisitions involving some of these technologies. And one of the ways that I have consistently even heard that described is it's so beyond what we understand that it's not impressive, right? It's like the cat or the dog sitting there looking at the iPhone. To them, it's very meaningless because they don't recognize that as being something important to them. And as humans, we naturally understand, again, in the framework of what Bob Lazar talks about in the stories, if these are true, we clearly understand, yeah, these are vehicles, these are craft with a technology far beyond anything we have. We've got to understand how this works and what that means. And yet, seamless technologies is not, bolts or rivets that hold it together. We can't even figure out what, according to those stories that Bob tells, what's holding this together. So as far as, framing this and looking at what kind of technology are we dealing with and what does that mean to humans, it's both something we recognize as extremely advanced and yet so strange and so simple that its significance almost escapes us based on how Bob described it.
Well, and it's scary, right? Because we don't know the power behind it. So you start messing around with something like that, like trying to drill into an orb or something. What happens if it explodes or we do something wrong? It's simple but scary.
If you were to take a nuclear bomb back in time and place it in front of, I don't know, the Acadians, what would they do? How likely is it they could figure out how it works? And if they did, that they would not blow themselves up, Very interesting.
And that's exactly what he describes in 2019 Streamland, his memoir, is literally that, having this technology on a table in a lab, and two guys are kind of poking at it to see what's going to happen. I mean, there's one, what sticks in my mind is one of the guy that he met as he walked in had a golf ball. He says, watch this. He threw the golf ball and it kind of came within the range of this cube-shaped object and just bounced and hit the ceiling with such force that it knocked some of the drop ceiling down. And Lazar said he was concerned, like, I just got on this job and we're destroying the lab, so he was looking for a broom. I mean, it's a very human thing to do in that moment, but it really is that level of, let's see what this does if we jab it with a screwdriver. I mean, it really seemed to have that sort of, what's the worst that could happen, but at the same time acknowledging that the power that it takes to run this is like the whole power grid in the United States. So how is this working in this moment? There's all this cognitive dissonance, I think, that he was going through in those original moments in that laboratory, allegedly.
We're going to talk more about what Lazar brought to light and, also power sources for these potential craft. But there's one thing in his background that has always been interesting to me, and that is that efforts have been made to verify or debunk his story. And one of the things that seems to be in question is his academic background. And proponents of Lazar's testimony will often say, well, the lack of, essentially what many will say is that there is a lack of academic records to support the degrees that he says he has or the institutions that he attended. And one of the things that more conspiratorially minded people will say is that that is the result of a government cover-up. What I'm curious about, and this is another one that Heather may have some insight on, how feasible, how difficult, how possible is it to interfere with those types of academic records?
Well, I don't know how easy it is because I've not had anybody try to mess with mine. I would think that, it's certainly, okay, let's put it this way. If the government wanted to cover up something, then I don't see what could stop them from covering it up if somebody wanted to cover up academic records as far as that goes. But in general, it shouldn't be that difficult to find out that somebody went to this school. I mean, you have yearbooks, you have classmates, for goodness sakes, that can verify you, dorm mates, things like that.
People send you report cards to the mail at that time,
Right,
too, right?
yeah.
I mean,
So, I mean, I don't think that it would be that difficult to track somebody down as far as their records go.
And of course, we can't, if a cover-up is in play,
Right.
there's no way to essentially know that because a cover-up is in play.
That's the way it always works.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical question, but it's something that I think is important.
There seems to be some historical precedent, at least, for cases where people who actually had held, positions of responsibility and high clearances and things within the government, that if they came forward and or even if they didn't, it later, was made aware, they were made aware of the fact that information about their involvement with projects or other past, education, jobs, things like that, can be withheld. And some have said, well, that seems to lend credence to Bob's claims. If we look at Stanton Friedman, of course, was a proponent of the idea that there are exotic craft from other worlds that are visiting our planet, and he really was, and it still is, I think, viewed as a champion of the subject. But he took a very skeptical attitude toward Bob Lazar, primarily because he said, I called MIT, I called Caltech, I called, the places where he worked, and these people did not know this guy. And so for Stanton Friedman, even if there's historical precedent for information being withheld or covered up or removed from the book, so to speak, and frankly, I'm kind of mind to think that if an agency or entity within the government wanted badly enough to do that, to an extent it probably could be done. But Stanton wasn't compelled by this. Stanton seemed to think, I think this guy unfortunately is lying about his education and his background. So the question really for me comes down to, well, how much information could successfully be withheld and covered up? But then we come back to the rocket car. I mean, I think it got coverage in some of the local newspapers, and even I think in one of the newspapers produced there at Los Alamos, and it described him as working there. So some have said, but some of the things he says that he did that others have disputed, there is at least some documentation that seems to support that.
Yeah, his name does show up in a phone book.
Yeah.
Yeah. And George Knapp is on record as having said, he took me back to Los Alamos, introduced me to people, so that at least it goes back that far.
And some of those people seem to have known him too, I think, when they went. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's evidence to sort of evidence to, I'm going to use the term loosely, to support either notion. Perhaps these elements of his background, that he had all these degrees from Caltech, MIT, perhaps that was some kind of a fabrication. But then other aspects of the story seem verifiable in that people seem to recognize him when he shows up at this facility. So, and I think we'll continue to see that as we go, but that's sort of what typifies conversations about Bob Lazar, is the verifiable and the unverifiable, and then finding ourselves in the middle.
And that's what makes him such a polarizing figure, right? There's no reason to ever have to, to kill the guy, right? If they want to off him, because he does himself the most disservice you can possibly do. I think he's probably a very intelligent guy, and he may have simply stretched truth a few times about where he went to school and things like that. I mean, that's common with a lot of things. But I think that initially he did so much damage to himself by coming out first with half-truths and outright lies that there's really no reason to even make up much stuff about this guy, because all the disinformation is coming out of his mouth.
It could be a case of, and this just came to me while you were saying that, it could be a case of he fudged his resume and really did get this job and has to stick with the original resume because that's now the narrative. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah. Everybody's going to have little white lies here, and I'm sure it also didn't apply through like Indeed or anything. I'm sure people checked it out. But I think that from the interviews that I've seen and reports that I've read, he is an intelligent human being, right? But then again, there's a lot of people out there that have, dropped out of high school and they know more about the Civil War than professors do. So just because he doesn't have the degrees doesn't mean that he's also not qualified to talk about the things that he's talking about.
See, what Ron's talking about, that is one of the things that just I think is the most perplexing thing about Bob Lazar. If he were just an anybody who's coming along and saying, yeah, I worked at S4, yeah, I saw flying saucers, that'd be one thing. But this guy builds rocket cars. I mean, this guy, he owns a business, right? United Nuclear literally sells scientific equipment, and he performs the work that one would associate with, your stereotypical scientist. I mean, by all intents and purposes, this seems to be a person who has a really advanced understanding of physics and technology, and yet he is not unimpeachable. And that's the great conundrum when it comes really to this entire subject. When we have a person, a whistleblower, effectively come forward and say, I worked here, I saw these things, these are the things I know. I can't tell you the whole story because I don't know it, but I can tell you based on what I saw. Your government's lying to you, and we know a whole lot more about these things in our sky than what we're being told. We have a person who says those things, but then we can't verify every aspect of their background. And then there are the other questions about, some of his past dealings, in Nevada and everything that's, of course, come out in recent years. And it just makes it all the more perplexing. What do you make of a story that seems so incredible by such a credible person, and yet someone whose background seems so tarnished and full of holes? It's just baffling.
He has to have some credentials or the government wouldn't hire him. The government, even if you enlist in the military, they do an extensive background. If you're going to go in as an airman first class or whatever, you're going to have your background is going to be scrutinized. So obviously there was enough there to allow him to be hired. And but as it might not have been through MIT though. It might not have been through one of those big types of universities.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's important or not, but he was hired as a contractor. And he was hoping to get hired on at S4 by performing well. Part of that was these late night phone calls, you have to come in now. Mm-hmm. So he would go in then and disrupt his whole life. That led to the dissolution of his marriage. That's part of his story, which is unfortunate. But that was part of the pressure he was under, I think, was that he wanted to make as good an impression as he could. And then it all fell apart because of the various pressures in his life. And that seemed to lead him down this path of, well, I'm going to blow the lid off of things.
Almost seems punitive in a way.
Yeah.
Like he's lashing back out at this organization.
Mm-hmm.
It might also be important to emphasize some of the reasons why he decided to come forward, because Bob had been going out there. He had made friends with people who shared his interest in UFOs. John Lear, of course, had probably been one of the most famous examples of this. And Bob and others would go out there close to Area 51. Bob did seem to know the schedule and when things would appear in the sky, and they would go out there and they would, have their little sky watches. And it was under these circumstances out there at night that they find themselves surrounded by Air Force security. What are you doing out here? And Bob got probably more than just a smack on the wrist for doing so. And so, as he said, he was now concerned about more than just his employment, and felt that really the only way he might be able to protect himself would be to come forward, first in silhouette, using that pseudonym Dennis, which again had actually been, he said, the name of one of his superiors. And he comes out with the story because he felt at that time it was all he could do. So there's the reason that he provides for why he's coming forward and telling these extraordinary stories. And even if one tries to dispute that, we have to look back and say this guy did know that there was something going on out there, and seemed to know the night of the week to go out and when you'd be able to see the light show. And that's what got him in trouble in the first place.
He knew enough to get himself in trouble, so it wasn't nothing.
Yeah.
Well, some of the statements that Bob Lazar made, I have a few quotes here. Katie, you mentioned, of course, that he had said there were 9 individual flying craft. One was described as having bullet holes in it, as if it had been damaged or shot down. Another, he used the term ancient, specifically saying that it was very old. You mentioned the archaeological dig as well. Another interesting thing that stuck out to me is that he said at least some of them were emblazoned with U.S. flags on the fuselage, as if they were test craft or something. I asked someone who I know, who at one time worked with the NRO, does the military place emblems on test craft, on top secret test craft? And I was thinking of the Blackbird and stealth bomber specifically. And this person, despite working with the NRO for a very long time, did not know the answer, and said specifically, they really only tell you what you need to know. And that's another one of Lazar's statements, is that this information is very compartmentalized. And that may be something we could find out by asking the right person. I did some digging and I couldn't find an answer on that. But he also talked about the propulsion systems and how they operate and what they're fueled by. And Mark and Katie, you touched on that a moment ago. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about these gravity propulsion systems and how they're supposed to have worked.
Mercury and element 115 I'm not a scientist, and I don't want to go talking about propulsion systems, but I do know he talked about these things before we knew about it. Although the other side of that coin is ultimately we know it exists. I mean, naturally it exists, so that's the other side of that coin. But he did mention it before anybody else did, so.
There's kind of this, again, we mentioned a mystery within an enigma. Probably the most enigmatic part of all this is really element 115.
Yeah.
And the stories that Bob not only had knowledge of this in advance of its actual discovery, although some have disputed and said, well, but I mean, knowledge of the potential existence of that element had been foreshadowed in some scientific literature. If Lazar had been aware of that literature, that's the question. But I mean, presumably it's been demonstrated he might have still been able to make up that aspect. But as he tells it, he not only was aware of the existence of this, but he had even smuggled a little portion of it out maybe and had this in his possession, and that further experiments had been done with element 115. This effectively was, behind the mechanism that propelled these craft. He also, in terms of the physical structure, described these, three kind of devices. They weren't really nozzles, but more like appendages that could be directed in a way such that the craft, he for instance describes the so-called sport model. This was one that he described having worked with, and it could allow this craft to rise up, hover, and then it would shift over onto what we would consider its side, and it would travel. Presumably this would be like an interstellar kind of a mode of travel where it would orient itself, what we would call, I guess, horizontally like that, and fly through belly first space. So it's very interesting the way that he describes the mechanics behind how these things worked, and further that they had in fact also tried to dissect that to try and understand and reverse engineer how these technologies worked, which actually led to an incident, I think, and a death, according to his story. One of his predecessors who had worked on this program said that they had actually been injured during some of these experiments.
That's something I read as well. Someone had actually been killed in an explosion as a result of trying to drill into one of these things, which I think you alluded to that a moment ago,
Poke
Heather.
at it.
Yeah,
Just see what happens.
Something gonna happen eventually.
That was in line with some of these reports we get, though, and some of the photograph and anecdotal evidence that these craft will tilt on their sides and ride a gravitational wave.
I mean, there was a really compelling video. I can't speak to whether it was, an authentic representation of a UFO, but this came out a few months back, and it seemed to show a small little saucer-like object. You definitely can see it, and in the preliminary analysis I did, this object's moving through the clouds. So obviously this was detected by whoever is operating the camera. Initially, this film had been attributed to a Colombian model. I think it was later said that she had not made the footage. It was someone else who posted this online. But as the object emerges from the clouds and comes in the direction of the camera, I mean, it appears to be a saucer-like craft, and what's it doing? It's flying just like that, with the, as I call it, belly first kind of movement. That's very consistent with how Lazar claimed that the sport model and other craft that he observed would have operated. It would have been at least one mode in which they operate.
Yeah, the most striking thing that I remember from his account is he said, when we think of things that generate gravity, when you think of the planet, I mean, that's the size of the core and then all the strata moving around it generates gravity. It's a world. But he's looking in this box on a table at a device that's generating gravity, or a bending of waves of gravity, however that works. And he said, and I have no idea how this can be happening, which I thought was a great way of sort of contrasting the forces that were at play in whatever this device was. That was essentially, if I recall this correctly, two pieces, like a base and another piece. And when you brought the piece closer, which had the element 115 in it, it would start to make this bend. He could look in and see almost like a pencil point of black nothingness, which he took to mean that's where the wave is being warped somehow. That would cause then something to move through that space in a different way. So that just the contrast between, typically we're talking about a planet makes gravity, and here's a little box that does the same thing. It's unbelievable.
So if you're reverse engineering and you get to that point, okay, can you still make it work but not understand how it works? You know what I mean? Like, if you don't understand the physics of it, can you still reproduce it so it could still be to your benefit, not understand anything about it at all? Can that happen from a engineering point of view? I'm not an engineer, that's the reason I'm asking the question.
Because I can drive a car, but I can't assemble one.
No,
So,
no.
yeah.
We're changing oil, we're changing tire either. That's just who I am. But I also could not reverse engineer anything. That's the whole thing.
And I think that's the hope. I mean, that's why Lazar and others were brought there, was to try that.
Right.
And, the reasoning being, well, you can make a rocket car, and et cetera. Maybe you could stumble backwards into whatever it is that makes this tick, and then we can reproduce it. I mean, that's the ultimate point, right? Is to be able to create these things for ourselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We have to kind of jump back and forth between if he's telling the truth, and then but then there's this aspect of it. Well, on the truthful side, part of how he described this entire situation had been, people were intentionally brought in. Some of them, what you might call, I would say, avocationalists. People who are really good at what they do, but maybe don't hold a degree and don't have the necessary background. Because one of the points of contention some have raised is, you look at the Manhattan Project, and you look at Oppenheimer, and you look at Teller, who, of course, Lazar said that he actually spoke to, and Edward Teller had actually, been involved in him getting that job. But anyway, with the Manhattan Project, the best of the best, some of the greatest scientists, and some who, of course, history recognizes as the most important of their era, they were the ones working on this. And you mean to tell me you wouldn't have the world's greatest scientists out there trying to reverse engineer a flying saucer? But Lazar's whole idea here is that intentionally you bring in less innocuous figures, but people who maybe have that kind of mad scientist, that sort of tinkerer kind of thing. Again, somebody who would be likely to build a jet car, right, a rocket propelled car. He's just the kind of person that's low profile enough, has a slightly checkered background, but who's also really capable, and we want to have him come in here and poke it with the proverbial stick and see what happens, see if he can figure it out. So that aspect of it does sort of make sense.
Yeah, not to be on Bob Lazar's side, but I am definitely on here, because if you bring these type of people in, if something would happen and they disappear, they're not going to make as big an impact as if they brought in somebody else, Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you get
It's easy to discredit the mad scientist, right?
Right.
It's simple.
So they come out and they say, hey, guess what I saw? Again, we see what's going on right now. That's the reason we're having this discussion right now. You automatically don't believe them, right? Yeah.
And wasn't his house raided? Do we have proof of that his house was
His business was raided.
His business was
if I'm
raided.
not
His
mistaken.
business was raided. That was described in the documentary film that Jeremy Corbell made. After the film came out, of course, people had wondered, is it true? Was there really a raid? And actually, my colleague, Tim McMillan, had been the fellow who filed the, I guess it was a Public Records Act request with that law enforcement agency that would have assisted with that raid, and they did confirm that indeed a raid had happened. So it is absolutely confirmed that his business had been raided. Now, the question, though, comes down to whether or not it had to do with what was implied in the film, which in the film it's implied that his business might have been raided with regard to Element 115. The very basic story, as I understand it, was that there had been, I think, a homicide investigation, and that there had been a substance that was purchased through Lazar's company. And what the raid had to do with was the investigation into the purchase and the individual who had used this substance in a presumed homicide. I think that was how the story went. So it is true that there was a raid, but the problem is that some have asserted that the reason for the raid might have been a little different from what has been alluded to by Lazar in various interviews he's given, and also as portrayed in the film. Now, again, I think the bigger point here being that what is portrayed in the film, there was a raid. It absolutely did happen. And further, here's a guy who runs a scientific business that sells, rather esoteric things, at least for the rest of us, unless you are a scientist, where he sells these things and he provides these services. And so, it's very strange that he would be a target of a raid. Now, some have also said that it could have been possible that there had been another reason for the raid other than what he was told and what the official reason given for the raid had been, and that has also been insinuated. So
it's a tough one, because you have all of these little things. We have flying saucer phenomena in the area where Bob was working at the time. We have the absence of government documents, but then like, oh, well, that's because it was a cover-up. He claims that he was subjected to an IRS audit that resulted in him going bankrupt, and that it was allegedly out of nowhere. And we can always take all these explanations and say, well, of course you got audited, you mismanaged your finances, and yeah, sure, you worked in this area, but that's because they were testing airplanes. But then in every case, Bob Lazar is the one consistent factor. Like every little aspect that we can debunk or point to, there's still this one guy at the center of all of it. And maybe that's kind of an obvious statement given that the name of this episode is Bob Lazar. But at a certain point, how many excuses do we have to make to explain away a story? You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, how many reasonable explanations do we have to put in one box before it is no longer a reasonable box?
Well, he really put Area 51 and S4 on the map, so we can credit Bob Lazar with that. So,
Unequivocally.
yeah.
Yeah.
That was a question I had. How much was Area 51 S4 talked about before Lazar came forward? Does anyone know? You guys put it on the map for sure. But...
Right. I know that people were getting on aircraft going to work. So I know that there were people who had knowledge that people were going to work flying out of an airport into some unknown area. So, I mean, there was this idea that there was something out there where people work and nobody knew about.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's interesting because he does mention the Janet flights, and that is something you can witness right there in Las Vegas are the Janet flights and other little details that he had mentioned that we know now turns out to be true. So again, it gets into that convoluted mix.
Lazar clearly knew a lot of things about people who would have worked out there and was aware of that and even described them correctly in terms of his own experience. As far as like how much was known about Area 51 before he comes out and talks about his experiences at S4, we do know, of course, that, going all the way back to the U-2 spy programs, our first, production of a spy plane for use in trying to do a high altitude reconnaissance of the Soviet Union. And primarily we were using aircraft at that time because we were just on the cusp of being able to do reconnaissance using satellites and things along those lines. Not quite to that point yet. We needed to know whether our foreign adversaries were developing nuclear weapons and what other kinds of weapons and armaments they were building. And so we needed these reconnaissance platforms. And so that really is the beginning of the story of Area 51, how we began our reconnaissance programs. And in fact, there's a very interesting documentary that was later made available to the public and in certain places can still be found online that tells the story of what they call Watertown. And it's narrated by a gentleman who's, very quaintly discussing the construction of the U-2 aircraft out there. And what this is, it is literally a short documentary film that was filmed at Area 51 for the families of employees who were involved in that project. So some certainly didn't know about Area 51 before Bob Lazar. But when he comes out and starts talking about it, it really begins to feed into a lot of the suspicion that was going on. And we look at what was happening in that part of the world around that time and some of the people like Norio Hayakawa, who is, an activist, and he's trying to get more people involved in this push for transparency about Area 51. There wasn't any official acknowledgement until maybe the 2010s, I believe. And there was I think a CIA history of the U-2 Oxcart program that was finally released. And that was the only first public admission all the way, so many decades after it came about. So, for those who would say, well, we would already know about it if this was something that was being developed a few decades ago. We knew about Area 51 largely thanks to Bob Lazar, but it wasn't officially acknowledged until decades after that. And now, today, of course, we all talk about it, we all know about it, but I do think, again, to Katie's point, we can really credit Bob Lazar in large part for the popularization of that and its association with UFOs.
Yeah, and not just that, but making it a destination, right? Before Bob, I don't think there were a whole lot of people going out there trying to get as close as possible or trying to find these strategic peaks that they could get a good shot. But after Bob, it just explodes and becomes a problem, I think, for the base.
They had to shut down Tickler Peak. So, you can't get up there anymore.
Oh,
Darn it.
Well, who among us is likely to have heard of Rachel, Nevada, if not for this whole saga, to put that place on the map?
But nobody would want to go through the desert and go through rattlesnakes and things like that just to see man-made test equipment, right? They're going there because they think that there's aliens there, right? That's what's going on, so.
Or see a UFO in flight. It's irresistible in a way. And what's so interesting to me too is that at that same time, you have the rise of the X-Files on Fox. You also have the rise of Coast to Coast AM and Art Bell, and he, having John Lear on the program, having Bob Lazar when he can finally get him. And this is all dovetailing at the same time. So in the 1990s, Area 51 goes from unknown quantity to a place that lots of people at least have romanticized and want to try to experience for themselves in some way. To the nth degree, to where in the 2010s now you've got Storm Area 51, where it's a movement, and STM almost got wrapped up in all of that.
Yeah. Mark, you make some really important points there too. I mean, he and I both, I think, products of the Art Bell and the late night radio kind of phenomenon. But in that era, I mean, we look at what was happening, some of the very early efforts by Robert Bigelow, who would go on to found the National Institute for Discovery Science, and of course purchases what we now know as Skinwalker Ranch. But, he funded an early radio program that Art Bell hosted that George Knapp and Linda Howe were staples of, and it was called Area 2000. So even the name was very derivative of the whole Area 51 phenomenon. And like Mark points out, there were all these things that were going on at that time that kind of bring together this public fascination. There is a little bit of myth building. Depending on who you ask, I'm sure a lot of people back in those days would have gone out there in the desert because, hey, on this stretch of highway outside of Rachel, Nevada, you can see UFOs. And it becomes a destination and frankly, a bit of a mecca for the UFO enthusiasts.
Yeah, a lot of people, myself included, will make the trip out there just to make that pilgrimage, to use that term.
In fact, a group of us are going next week. Not really, actually. But we can.
Catch us for the next episode, live from Area 51. Let's go.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact timeline in front of me because this kind of just came to me, so if I'm wrong here, you guys please correct me and we'll just cut this. But the Roswell incident took place in 1947. It did not stay in the popular public consciousness from that date forward. It was something that fell kind of into obscurity, and it arose more due to books and people looking into it around this time. I believe it was the early 80s that some of those books started to come out and really draw attention back to that case. And correct me if I've got the timeline wrong here, but I do wonder if there is some linkage there between, we've talked about what was in the public mind at the time with relation to some of these cases. If Roswell had just recently become a thing again, so to speak, it's an interesting timeline, is all I'm saying. I don't really have a conclusion with that.
Did Bob Lazar talk about J-Rod and them having aliens, live aliens at S4? Because if so, then that would tie in to one of the EB1 stories. So that there could be a connection there. I'm not sure.
Bob said on one occasion that he had walked by a room and saw the back of the head of something that he said didn't look human. Yeah. And that's what he described as being his one possible sighting of something, what we might call extraterrestrial biologics in the modern parlance. But he told other stories and things that he had heard, those of course secondhand. That was the only one I know of where he says he thinks he might have seen something.
No, my biggest thing is that Bob Lazar, the Bob Lazar case is a great example of the idea of compartmentalizing, that I can work on this and have no idea what's happening next door. Which just, to me, gives credence to they could be working on all kinds of horrible things, all kinds of scary things, and have access to technologies that we don't know or understand. Because I walked by this ship, I touched it, I got reprimanded, but I wasn't told anything about it. Later, he did get to go inside of a ship, correct? But he didn't have access to understanding what other people who were on the ship, what they were doing. They were tinkering with things, and he wasn't allowed to know or ask what was going on. So I think this case is just a really great example of the government compartmentalizing everybody's role, and you stick to your role, don't ask anybody else any questions, and then that makes it so when you do get out and you do come forward later, then you have these holes in your story, which doesn't help you, but it's just the way that it is.
You took me straight to the next question I wanted to ask, and that is, what about the idea that Lazar believes everything he is telling us? We won't, academic credentials and stuff aside, I still have a hard time with that. But as far as like the technology that he says he saw, the extraterrestrial beings, what if he believes everything that he is saying, but he himself is the victim of some kind of experiment, misinformation campaign, psychological something or other. Like, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of disinformation being put in there so that they can see who a leak might be, I think is very interesting. And it's entirely possible that there was something that he was fed that they would know later down the line, oh, this came out, it must be Bob Lazar or Bob and George or whoever was in the room with him at the time. Yeah, I think that it's something definitely worth exploring.
In terms of ensuring that people are trustworthy and that they are going to be equipped and capable of reliably handling classified information, I mean, it's absolutely something that the United States government does, where they, as a measure of being able to know who has provided information and who has shared things they shouldn't share, certain information, sometimes disinformation, is shared with people, and I've heard multiple examples over the years of that kind of thing happening. So the idea that in some cases the things that Lazar was shown or said that he observed, that he may have been provided bad information, but then he relates this and believes it. I mean, that's been a question that's raised. The problem I have with that is there's some pretty extraordinary things that he claims to have seen, including the operation of what appear to be vehicles, that really don't match anything known to exist in not only our U.S. inventory militarily, but also just, I think, more broadly in terms of our technological capabilities as team civilization. So how do you put on a show for someone that convincingly conveys to someone who can build a jet car that this flying saucer is not dangling from a cable, it's actually defying gravity with an unknown propulsion system? So this is actually where I start having a problem with the idea that, well, Lazar was lied to and therefore is unintentionally propagating misinformation on his part, having been provided disinformation from the government, which leads me to a couple of other possibilities. Now, naturally, most skeptics say, well, he's just a liar. I've wondered, though, is it possible that disinformation could come into play in another way here? What if the disinformation is being provided by Lazar himself? What if the information, and this sounds very conspiratorial, but if we're going to look at all the possibilities, we've got to put this one on the table too. What if he is intentionally presenting a narrative, knowing that this is going to drive a lot of thought about this topic and the United States government's involvement with it, and that his entire intent and purpose has been all along to inject disinformation himself? Again, I can't prove that, and I don't know if that's what it is, but that's also a possibility.
You have, and this has been, what you just said, this has been brought up a few times in this conversation, you have this scenario where we could have terrestrial government technology and they don't even want the people working on it to know exactly what it is or where it comes from. So it goes back to that compartmentalization of information. And now if someone sees this test craft flying over Nevada, instead of saying, oh, the government has this deadly weapon that can defy the laws of physics, I need to make sure people know about this, they go, oh, it's just another UFO sighting, that's the Bob Lazar thing, and we discard it and move along. And I think that's the natural response a lot of people have. So the idea that this whole thing could have been set up intentionally just to take some of us on that logical, oh man, now it's like thinking about it two ways at once.
Yeah. But now if Lazar was shown technologies that the U.S. was working on, again, it's strange that he would be brought in and asked to try and figure out how it works if they already built it themselves. But at least there is that possibility that if he were observing things that we built, he could have been misinformed himself. And so yet again, he may not be telling falsehoods, but he could be describing his understanding of technology that he witnessed, but was not told really where it came from. He was given a whole different story.
What happens if it was captured enemy technology?
Yeah. Is that, again, this is another thing we'll probably return to a lot, but is that scarier than extraterrestrials? In my mind, at least at the time, still very close to the Cold War era, that's scarier that people might have access to a gravity engine, to me.
That's right, I agree.
It could very well be that he's disinfo, misinfo. Absolutely. If so, he is excellent at what he does. He's a heck of a storyteller, I have to say. And the last chapter of his book is one example. Very disarming. He comes right out and says, if I had to do it over again, I'm not one of those people who would say, I'd do it all the very same way. He says, I wouldn't have come out, period, point blank, because of what it did to my life. It ruined my chances of being taken seriously. Fortunately, I landed on my feet. He had one wife die of illness, the other left him, and he did get remarried, has grandkids, and at the end of the book he says, They don't know me as the Area 51 guy at all, and that's fine with me. So take that for what it is. It's great storytelling at the very least, and if true, it's a very human way to sort of put a button on his entire experience.
Absolutely.
Whether or not you believe him, Bob Lazar is as much a part of the discussion over ETs and UFOs as UFOs themselves. Despite innumerable attempts to debunk him, he continues to be a point of reference and discussion for researchers and enthusiasts, as made evident by today's conversation.